The Archbishop's residence at Lambeth stood as a monument to duty and devotion, its stone walls rising grey and solemn against the London sky. Within its hallowed chambers, where centuries of ecclesiastical authority had shaped the moral fabric of England, Miss Cecilia Hughes moved like a shadow through rooms that had never quite felt like home. At 23, she had long since accepted that her life would be one of quiet service, of letters written on her father's behalf, of charitable committees attended with appropriate solemnity, of evenings spent in the company of bishops and their wives discussing matters of church governance, while the world beyond these walls lived and loved and laughed without her. The daughter of the Archbishop of Canterbury was not, after all, permitted the frivolities that other young women of her station enjoyed. There would be no seasons for Cecilia, no glittering ballrooms or eager suitors. Her father, the Most Reverend Edmund Hughes, had made clear from her earliest years that she was set apart, dedicated to higher purposes than the pursuit of matrimony. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and her father had interpreted this loss as divine instruction that his daughter was meant for spiritual service rather than earthly attachments. She had been raised accordingly, educated far beyond what was typical for women of her class, fluent in Latin and Greek, conversant in theological debate, capable of corresponding with scholars across Europe on her father's behalf. Yet, for all her learning, Cecilia remained profoundly alone. The spring morning that would alter the course of her existence began unremarkably. She sat at the small writing desk in her private sitting room, reviewing correspondence that required her father's attention. The Archbishop's duties were vast, and Cecilia had become essential to managing the endless stream of letters, petitions, and ecclesiastical business that flowed through Lambeth Palace. Her father relied upon her judgment to sort the urgent from the trivial, the sincere from the manipulative. It was tedious work, yet she performed it with the same meticulous care she brought to everything, finding in usefulness a substitute for happiness. The letter that caught her attention bore an unfamiliar seal, a hawk in flight pressed into black wax. The direction was written in a bold, decisive hand, quite unlike the careful script of most ecclesiastical correspondence. She turned it over, noting that it was addressed not to the Archbishop but to the Archbishop's household, an unusual ambiguity that made her hesitate before breaking the seal. The contents proved even more unexpected. The letter was from Alexander Ashley, the Duke of Ravenscroft, a name that sent a small shock through Cecilia's carefully ordered world. Even within the sheltered confines of Lambeth Palace, she had heard whispers of the Duke. He was said to be brilliant and dangerous, a man who had scandalized society 5 years past when his young wife had died under circumstances that remained the subject of dark speculation. Some said he had driven her to despair through neglect. Others whispered of worse. He had retreated to his northern estates after the scandal, emerging only rarely for parliamentary duties, his reputation preceding him like a cold wind. The letter itself was remarkable for its directness. The Duke wrote that he found himself in need of spiritual counsel, though he confessed to having little faith in the efficacy of such guidance. He had been advised by his physician that the darkness which had settled upon his mind following his wife's death required attention beyond medical science. Rather than seek the platitudes of a country vicar, he had determined to address his inquiry to the highest ecclesiastical authority in the land, reasoning that if God existed and could offer comfort, the Archbishop of Canterbury was best positioned to facilitate the introduction. The irreverence of the request should have offended Cecilia. Instead, she found herself reading the letter a second time, then a third, struck by the raw honesty beneath the sardonic tone. Here was a man in genuine anguish, using wit as armor against a pain he could not otherwise express. She recognized the strategy, for she employed it herself on occasion, deflecting with intelligence what she could not confront with emotion. Her father, she knew, would not respond to such a letter personally. the Archbishop received hundreds of petitions for spiritual guidance and had neither time nor inclination to engage with a nobleman whose reputation for godlessness was well established. The letter would be passed to a junior secretary who would compose a formulaic response recommending prayer and attendance at services. The Duke would receive his answer and think, with some justification, that the Church had nothing meaningful to offer a suffering soul. Cecilia sat for a long moment, the letter in her hands, wrestling with an impulse that felt both reckless and necessary. Then, before she could reconsider, she drew a fresh sheet of paper toward her and began to write. She did not identify herself as the Archbishop's daughter. She signed the letter simply as a member of the Archbishop's household who had been moved by his inquiry to offer what thoughts she could. She wrote of doubt as a companion to faith rather than its enemy, of the darkness that sometimes descended upon even the most devout, of the possibility that seeking answers was itself a form of prayer. She wrote with a frankness she had never permitted herself, as though the anonymity of the correspondence freed her from the constraints that governed every other aspect of her existence. When she sealed the letter and dispatched it with the day's outgoing post, Cecilia told herself it was an act of Christian charity, nothing more. She expected no reply, or at most a brief acknowledgement that would end the matter. She did not anticipate that the Duke's response would arrive within the week, that it would be twice the length of his original letter, that it would pose questions so penetrating and observations so acute that she would find herself utterly unable to resist answering them. Thus began a correspondence that would consume Cecilia's thoughts and transform her understanding of everything she had believed about herself and her carefully circumscribed world. The Duke wrote of philosophy and politics, of art and architecture, of books he had read and places he had travelled. He challenged her assertions and built upon her arguments, treating her as an intellectual equal in a way no one else ever had. He confessed his sins and his sorrows with a candour that left her breathless, describing the slow dissolution of his marriage, the guilt he carried for his wife's unhappiness, the moment he had found her lifeless in the garden, and known that whatever had killed her, whether accident or intention, he bore some measure of responsibility. In turn, Cecilia found herself revealing truths she had never spoken aloud. She wrote of her loneliness within the vast machinery of church administration, of her hunger for connection that her position made impossible to satisfy, of the secret doubt she harboured about a God who would condemn her to such isolation. She wrote of her mother, dead these 23 years, whose absence had shaped everything her father demanded of her. She wrote of the life she might have lived had circumstances been different, the travels she longed to take, the conversations she yearned to have with people who saw her as something more than the Archbishop's dutiful shadow. She did not reveal her identity. This omission, which had begun as simple prudence, became increasingly deliberate as the weeks passed. Within the letters, she could be anyone. She could be simply herself, without the weight of her father's position or the expectations that came with it. The Duke addressed her as his correspondent, a title that made her smile each time she saw it, and she addressed him with equal simplicity as Sir, maintaining a formality that somehow made their intimacy more profound rather than less. 3 months into their exchange, the Duke wrote something that stopped Cecilia's heart. I find myself in the extraordinary position of caring more for the opinion of a stranger I have never met than for all the assembled judgments of a society that has known me since birth. I do not know your name or your face, yet I believe you know me better than anyone living. This is either the beginning of wisdom or the final proof of my madness. I confess I cannot determine which, and I find, somewhat to my surprise, that I do not care. Cecilia read these words in the privacy of her sitting room, the spring having given way to summer and the summer now fading into autumn's golden decline. Outside her window, the Thames flowed past as it had for centuries, indifferent to the tumult within her breast. She had fallen in love with a man she had never seen, through nothing more than the words he had written on paper. The impossibility of it did not make it less true. What could come of such an attachment? She was the Archbishop's daughter, forbidden from romantic entanglement, bound to a life of service that permitted no deviation. He was a duke whose reputation had been destroyed by scandal, a man society had judged and found wanting. Even if she revealed herself, even if by some miracle he felt, as she did, her father would never consent to such a match. The Archbishop had made clear that should Cecilia ever wish to marry, her suitor would need to be a man of unimpeachable moral standing, preferably a clergyman himself, someone who would support rather than compromise her father's position. The Duke of Ravenscroft was the precise opposite of everything Edmund Hughes would accept for his daughter. Yet, Cecilia could not bring herself to end the correspondence. Each letter had become essential to her existence, a lifeline connecting her to something vital and true. She told herself that as long as she remained anonymous, as long as the exchange existed only on paper, she was committing no real transgression. This comfortable fiction sustained her through the autumn and into the winter, until the day her father summoned her to his study with a gravity that told her something had fundamentally changed. The Archbishop sat behind his massive desk, a letter open before him that Cecilia recognised with a lurch of terror. The Duke's seal, the hawk in flight, was unmistakable even from across the room. Her father's expression was thunderous, his voice cold with a fury she had rarely witnessed directed at her. Cecilia. He spoke her name like an indictment. Would you care to explain why the Duke of Ravenscroft has written to me requesting permission to court my daughter? Cecilia felt the blood drain from her face. She had been so careful, had never revealed her identity in any of their exchanges. How could he possibly have discovered who she was? The Duke's letter provided the answer, which her father read aloud with barely contained rage. The Duke had written that he had been corresponding for 6 months with a member of the Archbishop's household, someone whose wisdom and compassion had restored his faith in the possibility of human connection. He had made inquiries, discreet but thorough, and had determined that his correspondent could only be Miss Cecilia Hughes, whose education and position within Lambeth Palace matched the evidence contained within the letters themselves. He had written to the Archbishop not to expose or embarrass his daughter, but to honourably declare his intentions and request the opportunity to meet her properly. He had enclosed the entirety of their correspondence as evidence of the respectful and virtuous nature of their exchange. He had done everything correctly, everything that propriety and honour demanded, and in doing so, he had destroyed Cecilia's carefully constructed world. The Archbishop's fury was absolute. He spoke of betrayal and disobedience, of the scandal that would engulf them if word of this correspondence became public, of the damage to his position and authority. He demanded to know how Cecilia could have been so foolish, so wanton, so utterly lacking in the judgment he had spent 23 years trying to instill. Through it all, Cecilia stood silent, absorbing her father's wrath like a penitent accepting just punishment. When at last he paused for breath, she spoke the only words that mattered. "Do you intend to respond to his letter?" The Archbishop's eyes narrowed. "I intend to inform the Duke that his inquiry is unwelcome and that any further contact with my daughter will be met with the full weight of ecclesiastical and social censure. You will not write to him again. You will not speak of him. You will forget this entire sordid episode and return to the duties appropriate to your station." "Father," Cecilia began, but he cut her off with a gesture so sharp it might have been a blow. "You are not a woman free to bestow her affections where she chooses, Cecilia. You are the Archbishop of Canterbury's daughter. Your behaviour reflects upon this office, upon the Church itself. Did you imagine I would permit you to attach yourself to a man whose wife died under a cloud of suspicion? A man who has openly mocked religious faith? A man who represents everything opposed to the values we uphold?" "He is not what rumour has made him," Cecilia said quietly. If you read the letters, you would see. I have read enough." The Archbishop's voice was final. The matter is closed. The weeks that followed were the darkest of Cecilia's life. Her father watched her with suspicious vigilance, intercepting her correspondence, restricting her movements, treating her like a prisoner in the home that had always been more duty than sanctuary. She was permitted no privacy, no opportunity to send word to the Duke explaining her silence. She could only imagine what he must think, having declared himself so honourably only to receive what she assumed was a devastating rejection from her father. The winter deepened around Lambeth Palace, and Cecilia felt herself fading with the light. The purpose that had sustained her through years of lonely service had been revealed as hollow, a poor substitute for the genuine connection she had briefly known. She performed her duties mechanically, speaking when spoken to, attending the functions her position required, all the while feeling as though some essential part of herself had been locked away where she could no longer reach it. It was during one such function, a reception for visiting clergy from the continent, that Cecilia first saw him. The Duke of Ravenscroft had not been invited to this gathering of ecclesiastical luminaries, yet there he stood in the doorway of the great hall, his presence causing a ripple of shock and whispered speculation to spread through the assembled guests. He was taller than she had imagined from his letters, dark-haired and severe of countenance, with eyes that swept the room with an intensity that made her breath catch. When those eyes found her, when they stopped and held and communicated something that needed no words to understand, Cecilia knew that everything her father had tried to prevent was about to come to pass anyway. The Duke crossed the room with the purposeful stride of a man who had made a decision and would not be deterred. Guests parted before him, some from respect for his rank, others from the discomfort his notorious reputation provoked. He stopped before Cecilia, executed a bow that was perfectly correct in form, if not in context, and spoke words that silenced every conversation in the hall. "Miss Hughes." His voice was exactly as she had imagined it, low and resonant with an undertone of carefully controlled emotion. "I have received no response to my letter to your father, and I find I cannot let the matter rest without knowing your mind directly. I am aware that this approach is irregular and that it may cause you embarrassment. I am aware that your father has made his opposition clear through his silence. But I have learned, through our correspondence, that you value honesty above social convention. So I will be honest. I love you. I have loved you since your third letter, when you wrote of doubt as the shadow that proves the existence of light. I love your mind and your courage and the compassion that moved you to answer a stranger's cry for help. I have come here tonight not to defy your father or to cause a scandal, but simply to ask you, before all these witnesses, whether my regard is returned. If you tell me that it is not, I will withdraw and trouble you no more. But if there is any chance, any possibility that you feel as I do, then I must know it." The silence that followed his declaration was absolute. Every eye in the great hall had turned to Cecilia, waiting for her response. She could feel her father's gaze burning into her from across the room, could sense the weight of expectation and judgment pressing down upon her from every direction. In that moment, all the years of obedience, all the careful suppression of her own desires, all the acceptance of a life defined by duty rather than choice, rose up in her throat, like a wave about to break. She thought of her mother, dead before she could know her daughter, and wondered what advice that unknown woman might have given. She thought of the life her father had designed for her, useful and empty and safe. She thought of the letters she had written and received, the connection that had transformed her understanding of what existence could contain. And she thought of the man standing before her, who had risked everything to ask her a question in front of witnesses who would carry his words to every corner of society before the night was through. "Your regard is returned," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling that had seized her body. "I love you, Your Grace." I have loved you for longer than I permitted myself to acknowledge. The murmur that swept through the hall was like the sound of the sea, but Cecilia heard none of it. She was looking at the Duke's face, watching the transformation that her words had wrought, the way his severe features softened into something approaching wonder. He reached for her hand, raised it to his lips, and pressed a kiss to her gloved fingers that somehow felt more intimate than any touch she had ever known. "Then we shall face whatever comes together," he said simply. The whatever came arrived in the form of her father, pushing through the crowd with a face like granite. "Archbishop," the Duke said before Edmund Hughes could speak, "I understand your objections to this match. I understand that my reputation has been tarnished by circumstances I could not control and responses I have not adequately made. But I give you my word, before God and all these witnesses, that I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of your daughter. I ask nothing more than the chance to demonstrate that the man I was is not the man I have become." The Archbishop's voice was tight with controlled fury. "You ask for a great deal, Your Grace. You ask me to entrust my only child to a man society has condemned." "I ask you to trust your daughter's judgment," the Duke replied. "She knows me better than anyone living. She has seen the worst of my soul through our correspondence and chosen to love me nonetheless. Is that not evidence of character that outweighs the whispers of those who have never troubled to look beyond the surface?" The confrontation might have continued indefinitely had not another voice intervened. The Bishop of London, a man whose moral authority was second only to the Archbishop himself, stepped forward from the crowd. "Edmund," he said quietly, "I have read the letters. The Duke sent copies to me along with his request that I intercede on his behalf." The Archbishop's expression flickered with surprise and something that might have been betrayal. "You knew of this, Thomas?" "I knew, and I counselled the Duke that his only hope was to speak directly to your daughter in a setting where his sincerity could not be questioned." The bishop's gaze was compassionate but firm. "Edmund, I have known you for 30 years. I have watched you raise Cecilia with devotion and strictness, determined to protect her from the world's corruptions. But in your zeal to keep her safe, you have also kept her imprisoned. This man offers her freedom, connection, and love, things you have not been able to provide despite your best intentions. Will you truly deny her this chance at happiness because his past does not conform to your expectations?" The Archbishop stood silent, surrounded by witnesses whose presence made any response a public declaration. Cecilia watched her father's face, seeing the conflict there, the pride and the fear, and somewhere beneath them both, the love that had expressed itself so imperfectly throughout her life. It was this love she addressed when she finally spoke. "Father, I have tried to be the daughter you required. I have studied what you wished me to study, served where you wished me to serve, and accepted the limitations you placed upon my life without complaint. But I am not a child any longer. I am a woman who has discovered what it means to be truly known by another person. And I cannot pretend that discovery has not changed me. You may forbid this match. You have the authority to make my life very difficult if I defy you. But you cannot make me unlove him, and you cannot make me return to the half-existence I led before his letters opened a door I did not know was there. I am asking you, as your daughter who loves you despite everything, to let me choose my own path." The great hall had grown so quiet that Cecilia could hear the crackle of candles in their sconces. Her father's face was unreadable, and for a long moment she thought he would refuse, would walk away and never speak to her again, would make her choose between the family she had known and the future she desired. Then, slowly, something in Edmund Hughes's rigid posture gave way. He looked at the Duke with an expression that mixed warning with reluctant acceptance. "If you hurt her," he said quietly, "there is no corner of England, no refuge on earth, where you will be safe from my wrath." "I understand," the Duke replied with equal gravity. "And I welcome the warning. A man should fear the consequences of causing pain to the woman he loves. It keeps him careful." The Archbishop nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been missed by those watching from a distance. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Cecilia standing beside the Duke in the centre of a room full of witnesses to the most unconventional courtship declaration London had ever seen. The scandal that followed was everything Cecilia had feared, and nothing she had anticipated. Society's initial shock gave way to fascination as the story of their correspondence became known. The letters themselves, excerpts of which appeared in the papers despite every effort at discretion, revealed a love story so compelling that even the most hardened cynics found themselves moved. The Duke's reputation, so long defined by the tragedy of his first marriage, began to shift as people read his words and recognized the genuine anguish and growth they contained. The wedding took place 3 months later, in a small chapel rather than the grand cathedral her father's position might have warranted. The Archbishop himself officiated, his voice steady if not warm as he pronounced the words that bound his daughter to a man he was learning to accept, if not yet embrace. The Duke's estate in the north welcomed its new Duchess with a combination of curiosity and hope, the servants having endured years of their master's grief-stricken isolation and eager to see what changes a woman's presence might bring. For Cecilia, the transition from Lambeth Palace to Ravenscroft Manor was both liberation and discovery. She explored her new home with the wonder of someone who had spent too long confined to familiar spaces, finding beauty in the wild moors that surrounded the estate, in the ancient library that contained treasures her husband had collected from his travels, in the simple freedom to walk where she wished and speak what she thought without fear of censure. But it was the continuation of their correspondence, now conducted face-to-face across breakfast tables and beside evening fires, that brought her the greatest joy. They talked as they had written, with honesty and depth, and a willingness to explore ideas wherever they led. The Duke revealed aspects of himself that letters had only hinted at. His passion for astronomy, which led to long nights on the manor's roof watching stars wheel overhead. His unexpected talent for music, which he had abandoned after his first wife's death, but now tentatively resumed at Cecilia's encouragement. His fierce protectiveness of the tenants who worked his lands, a side of his character that society gossip had never thought to mention. Cecilia, in turn, discovered capacities within herself that her former life had never allowed to develop. She found she had a gift for managing the estate's charitable endeavours, bringing the organisational skills she had honed at Lambeth to serve causes that actually improved people's lives. She began writing essays on theological subjects, which her husband encouraged her to publish under a pseudonym, and which attracted a small but devoted following among readers hungry for faith that engaged with doubt rather than dismissing it. She learned, too, what it meant to be loved completely, without reservation or condition, and the learning transformed her in ways she had not known she needed to be transformed. The shadows of the past did not disappear entirely. The Duke still woke some nights gasping from dreams of his first wife, guilt a wound that healed slowly, despite Cecilia's patient ministrations. Her father remained distant for the first year of her marriage, his letters formal and brief, his rare visits stiff with unspoken reproach. Society never quite decided whether to rehabilitate the Duke entirely or to maintain a wary distance, settling eventually for a grudging acceptance that permitted the couple to move through the world without constant whispered commentary. But these shadows were just that, darkness at the edges of a life filled with more light than Cecilia had ever imagined possible. When she discovered she was with child in the second year of their marriage, the news felt less like a surprise than a confirmation of everything their union had already proven. that love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances. That connection was possible between souls that society deemed incompatible, that redemption was available to those willing to reach for it with honest hands. The child, a daughter born on a storm-swept winter night, entered the world with a cry that echoed through the ancient halls of Ravenscroft Manor like a declaration of new beginning. The Duke wept when he held her for the first time, tears he made no effort to hide from the wife who knew him better than anyone living. "We shall name her Hope," he said softly, looking at the small face already showing signs of her mother's determined chin. "For that is what you have given me, Cecilia. Hope that the darkness is not the end of the story." Cecilia took his hand, her own tears falling freely as she watched her husband cradle their child with a tenderness that would have astonished those who knew only his reputation. She thought of the letter that had started everything, the desperate inquiry from a man seeking solace he did not believe he deserved. She thought of her own bold response, the impulse that had seemed so reckless at the time and had led to everything that now surrounded her. "Hope is a good name," she agreed. "But I was thinking of another as well." "What name?" he asked. "Correspondence." Cecilia smiled at his confused expression. "It is where we began. It is how you found me when I did not know I was lost. And it is what we shall teach her, this daughter of ours, the importance of reaching out, of writing the letter even when the reply seems impossible, of believing that connection exists for those brave enough to seek it." The Duke kissed her forehead, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, and outside the window the storm began to quiet, making way for stars. 5 years later, the family that had begun with letters had grown to include 2 more children. A boy named Edmund, in belated honour of the grandfather who had finally, grudgingly, accepted that his daughter's choice had been wiser than his fears, and another girl named for the Duke's mother, whose portrait now hung in a place of honour above the fireplace where Cecilia read stories to her children each evening. The Archbishop's visits had become regular occurrences, his initial stiffness giving way to a genuine affection for his grandchildren and a respect for his son-in-law that he expressed through theological debates that sometimes lasted well past midnight. The old man had mellowed in his later years, and Cecilia suspected that witnessing his daughter's happiness had done more to soften his rigid certainties than any argument ever could. The Duke's reputation had undergone a transformation so complete that newcomers to society sometimes struggled to understand why he had ever been notorious. His work in Parliament on behalf of the poor and his patronage of educational reforms had earned him admirers, even among those who had once condemned him. The essays Cecilia continued to publish had gained a following significant enough that her pseudonym had become an open secret, and invitations to lecture at universities arrived with flattering regularity. Yet, for all these public achievements, it was the private moments that defined their life together. The conversations that still ranged across every subject with the same intensity they had possessed in letters long ago. The quiet evenings when the Duke read aloud while Cecilia worked at her correspondence, her pen scratching softly in accompaniment to his voice. The walks across the moors where they had first learned to speak aloud what they had previously only written, discovering that words sounded different on the tongue than they appeared on paper, but no less true for the translation. On the anniversary of their first meeting at that fateful reception, a date they celebrated each year with a private dinner, the Duke presented Cecilia with a gift. A bound volume containing every letter they had ever exchanged, preserved and arranged in chronological order, each one a chapter in the story of how 2 unlikely souls had found their way to each other. "I have been thinking," he said as she paged through the volume with tears in her eyes, "about what you told me that night, about correspondence being how I found you when you did not know you were lost. It has occurred to me that the reverse is equally true. You found me, Cecilia." You answered a letter you had no obligation to answer, from a man you had every reason to ignore. You saw through the bitterness and the doubt to something worth saving. Everything I am now, everything we have built together, began with your choice to reach out when silence would have been so much easier. Cecilia closed the volume and set it aside, taking her husband's hands in her own. The choice was not difficult, she said softly. Even then, before I knew your face or your voice, I recognized something in your words that called to something in me. We were both lost, Alexander. We simply had the great fortune to be lost in ways that led us toward each other. He drew her close and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of a heart she had come to know as well as her own. Outside, their children's laughter drifted up from the garden where their nurse was conducting some elaborate game involving imaginary dragons and brave knights. The sound was the music of ordinary happiness, the kind of joy that Cecilia had once believed was not meant for someone in her position. I still cannot quite believe it sometimes, she admitted. All of this. You, the children, this life. When I think of who I was before your letter arrived, the woman I might have remained forever if circumstances had been slightly different, it frightens me. The Duke's arms tightened around her. Then we shall simply have to be grateful every day that circumstances were not different. That you were brave enough to write back. That your father, despite everything, loved you enough to let you go in the end. That the story turned out this way instead of all the other ways it might have gone. Cecilia lifted her face to meet his kiss, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together, yet still carried within it an echo of the miracle that had brought them to this point. When they parted, she smiled at him with an expression that contained all the words she would spend a lifetime still finding new ways to say. I love you, she said simply, because sometimes the simplest declarations were the truest ones. And I love you, he replied, now and always. In the study where they had shared so many conversations, a fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across shelves lined with books and the comfortable furniture that had witnessed the daily unfolding of their shared life. On the desk where Cecilia still wrote her essays and managed her correspondence sat a small painted miniature of their 3 children, commissioned the previous Christmas. Beside it lay a letter recently arrived from a young woman seeking advice about a difficult family situation, the latest in a steady stream of correspondence from readers who had found comfort in Cecilia's published words, and hoped she might offer personal guidance as well. She would answer it tomorrow as she answered all such letters, with the same care and honesty that had characterized her first bold response to a stranger's cry for help. She had learned that the impulse which had led her to write to the Duke was not an aberration, but rather an expression of her truest self, a capacity for connection that her sheltered life had suppressed but never extinguished. Now she offered that gift freely, knowing that somewhere, someone might be waiting for a word of understanding that could change everything. The Archbishop's daughter had been forbidden to love, and for 23 years she had obeyed that prohibition, not knowing what she was missing, not understanding the cost of her compliance. But the Duke's letters had changed everything, as letters sometimes do, carrying truth across the distance between isolated hearts, building bridges where none had seemed possible, proving that even the most carefully constructed walls can be breached by words written with genuine feeling and received by a soul ready to hear them. As evening settled over Ravenscroft Manor, and the children were called in from their play and the household began its familiar rituals of dinner and stories and bedtime, Cecilia Ashley, Duchess of Ravenscroft, stood for a moment at the window of her sitting room, looking out at the moors that had become as dear to her as any landscape could be. She thought of the young woman she had been, moving like a shadow through the halls of Lambeth Palace, believing that duty was sufficient compensation for happiness. She thought of the letter that had arrived on an ordinary spring morning, bearing a seal she did not recognize, and words that would reshape her understanding of everything. She thought of all the small choices that had led from that moment to this one, each one seeming insignificant at the time, all of them essential to the life she now lived. The door opened behind her, and she turned to see her husband entering with their youngest daughter in his arms, the child's sleepy head resting against his shoulder. "She says she cannot sleep without a story from both her parents," the Duke announced with mock solemnity, "and I have been designated to fetch you for this important duty." Cecilia smiled, crossing to take her husband's free hand as they walked together toward the nursery where their other children already waited. "Of course," she said. "What story shall we tell tonight?" The Duke's eyes met hers with the warmth that had never faded despite the years, the connection that had been forged in letters and strengthened by every day they had spent together since. "I was thinking," he said softly, "of a story about a woman who answered a letter she had no reason to answer, and a man who was saved by her courage." "The children have heard that one before," Cecilia pointed out. "Then perhaps," her husband replied, "we shall simply have to tell it again, because some stories never grow old." And indeed, as they settled among their children in the warm nursery, with the fire crackling and the night pressing gently against the windows, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft told once more the tale of how they had found each other against all odds, how letters had carried love across the distance between two lonely hearts, and how the choice to reach out to a stranger had opened doors neither of them had known existed. Their children listened with the rapt attention they always brought to this particular story, even though they knew every word by heart. Because some stories, the ones that matter most, can bear infinite repetition without losing their power to move and inspire. And this story, the one that had begun with a desperate man's letter and a sheltered woman's impulsive reply, was one of those. It was the story of their family, the foundation upon which everything else had been built, the proof that love could flourish in the most unlikely soil. That connection was possible between souls that the world deemed incompatible, that happy endings were not merely the stuff of fairy tales, but achievable by ordinary people brave enough to reach for them. Outside, the first stars were appearing over the moors, pinpricks of ancient light in the darkening sky. Inside, surrounded by the warmth of family and fire and love, Cecilia Ashley felt the fullness of a life she had once believed impossible, and was grateful beyond words for the letter that had changed everything.